Operation Cobra, the American breakout at Avranches on the 25th of July 1944, lifted the lid off the can in which the Germans sought to confine the Allies after the D-Day landings in Normandy 7 weeks earlier. Until then, the German defense, savage, hard-fought and extremely costly, had managed to hold the line against all Allied attempts to progress very far beyond the beachheads and move on into the rest of France. This was accomplished despite critical shortages of men and material, and the impossible demands of Adolf Hitler, whose basic and only strategy was never retreat, never surrender, and fight to the last man. After several failed attempts made at tremendous cost, the British and Canadians had at last established control over the northern districts by the 10th of July. But the Germans were still holding out in the south and southeast, and Operation Goodwood, the attempt to dislodge them, had failed disastrously on the 18th of July. This failure caused hot controversy within the Allied High Command. There was heavy criticism of General Bernard Montgomery, the British commander of the 21st Army Group, who had initiated Goodwood. US General Omar Bradley believed that Montgomery was going to be sacked. Montgomery remained, but at the height of the arguments, Operation Cobra completely changed the picture. Its success negated all the advantages the Germans still retained in France and made further defense irrelevant. For the Germans, the imperative now was to escape and preserve what they could of their hard-pressed forces for the defense of the fatherland. The situation after the success of Operation Cobra was symptomatic of the Axis war effort as a whole. Neither Germany nor Japan could match the industrial might of the Allies, and their losses, which the Allies could absorb, were slowly strangling their war efforts. After 5 years of a war that had seen their early spectacular victories, both Germans and Japanese were on the run, fighting desperately to prevent the enemy from closing in on their home territories. The Japanese were being chased from one Pacific island to the next and fought with manic desperation. Often they reacted to defeat by committing seppuku, ritual suicide. The finishing line for the Americans' island-hopping campaigns was the islands of Japan themselves, which to the Japanese were sacred soil. For them, the fate of their divine emperor Hirohito was also at stake. But by mid-1944, the noose was tightening fast as the Americans reached Guam in the Mariana Islands in the West Pacific. Guam was about 1,100 miles from the nearest Japanese territory, the Bonin Islands. And the Americans had those vital advantages: command of the air and of the seas. In Europe, the Germans were being assailed in the east and the south as well as the west. By 1944, the Russians had advanced beyond their own borders to force the surrender of Germany's ally Romania and enter the Bulgarian capital, Sofia. In southern Europe, despite the masterly defense put up by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the Allies had captured Rome, Rimini and Florence and were pressurizing the Germans' Gothic defense line. Under these immense pressures, Hitler's ideas for staving off disaster had turned bizarre. His vengeance weapons, the V-1 pilotless flying bomb and the V-2 rocket, were the stuff of fantasy science fiction. The vengeance was Hitler's answer to the Allied bombing of Germany. But the notion that the V-weapons might turn the course of the war in Germany's favor was also present. In England, the first V1, which was powered by a pulse jet engine and carried a 1-ton warhead, fell on London on the 13th of June 1944. The throaty roar of its engine, then the sudden silence as it cut out and the V1 plunged to earth, was a terrifying moment for everyone who heard it. The V2 liquid-fueled rocket, 46 feet long and weighing 13 tons, was able to fall out of the sky with only a whisper of sound as a last-minute warning that always came too late. The sheer craziness of the V-weapon campaign doubtless played its part in a plot to kill Hitler that had been brewing since 1942. On the 20th of July 1944, a one-armed veteran, Count Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, placed a briefcase containing a time bomb beneath a heavy oak map table in a hut at Hitler's Rastenburg headquarters. The bomb blew up at 12:42 hours during a high-level conference, but Adolf Hitler was not among the dead. He had, it seems, been saved by the thickness of the tabletop. The Führer's revenge was terrible. Around 200 people were put on trial and executed. Some of them had been only on the periphery of the plot, but implication was enough. Several high-ranking suspects were obliged to kill themselves, including Erwin Rommel, who was in hospital after suffering a fractured skull when his staff car was strafed on the 17th of July. General Ludwig Beck, former Chief of the General Staff, and Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who took over Rommel's command after he was injured. Kluge was sacked within a month for failing to warn Hitler of the bomb plot. Hitler had always entertained deep hatred and jealousy of the Prussian officer class to which von Stauffenberg and other high-ranked conspirators belonged, and came to believe that the entire Wehrmacht was riddled with them. He wasn't wrong either. The German army had been the focus of several plots to assassinate the Führer since before the war. Army officers, for their part, had contempt for Hitler and his fanciful ideas of military strategy, which had already brought disaster and shame on the German army in Russia. Fear, suspicion, and the dread that Hitler's vengeance might fall on anyone at any time was a corrosive factor in the plight of German commanders in France. All the more so when their task was to save what they could of their remaining forces and extricate them from the Allied trap that began to close after Operation Cobra. US General George Smith Patton, Jr. was a hot-headed, egotistical commander, but one whose capacity for aggression made it impossible for General Eisenhower to dismiss him. Patton's behavior gave Eisenhower plenty of opportunity. The incident in Sicily, when he slapped the face of a young soldier suffering from battle fatigue, made Patton notorious. He did it again a week later. Though he apologized, Patton was relegated and spent almost a year kicking his heels before he was given command of the US Third Army in January 1944. But Patton's stern war face and his mask of insensitivity and swaggering self-confidence hid a man of too much emotion and too much self-doubt to justify his own concept of an effective military commander. War, said Patton, is very simple, direct, and ruthless. It takes a simple, direct, and ruthless man to wage war. In this context, Patton's performance as a hard-nosed bully was impeccable. Not surprisingly, he aroused opposing reactions. He was hated and admired in equal measure. The contrast between the pugnacious Patton and the self-effacing General Omar Nelson Bradley could hardly have been more complete. Whereas Patton was always hot news for war correspondents, Bradley's understated style of command afforded little copy. Bradley failed to distinguish himself at West Point, and the first 28 years of his military career were frustrating. His assignments kept him at home in the United States, and he once remarked that he spent the years between the First and Second World Wars apologizing for his lack of combat experience. But those years were far from wasted. As a tutor at West Point, Fort Benning and Leavenworth Infantry School, Bradley developed his tactical skills and his own sympathetic style for the handling of troops. In 1943, Bradley transferred to the North African Front, where he served as Eisenhower's advisor, and at last saw action when he led the 2nd Corps of Patton's 7th Army in Sicily. The following year, in Normandy, Bradley commanded the 1st Army on D-Day, and later saw them through the long, laborious struggle to overcome German resistance in the Cotentin Peninsula. At last, the war correspondents had something to write about. Noting how greatly Bradley was admired by his troops, the journalists labelled him the Soldiers' General. Field Marshal Gunther Hans von Kluge was one of the elder statesmen among German military commanders in the Second World War. His career had begun as long ago as 1901. Later, Kluge was in command of Army Group Center, which challenged but failed to overcome the Russian defenders of Moscow in the winter of 1941. In July 1944, when Hitler dismissed Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Kluge replaced him as overall commander of the German forces defending France. But by this time, Kluge had realized that Hitler's strategy meant the destruction of the army. Kluge became extremely pessimistic about Germany's chances in the war, but he never discovered if his prognosis was correct. Hitler suspected that he was implicated in the bomb plot of the 20th of July. He was relieved of his command on the 17th of August and ordered back to Germany. 2 days later, while on the way, Kluge killed himself at Metz in northeastern France. Late in June 1944, Colonel General Paul Hauser was given command of the 7th Army, despite the protests of Erwin Rommel. Like Kluge, Hauser came from a long-established military family. He was 64 years old and a convinced Nazi, which Rommel was not. Hauser had seen service in the First World War, but defeat in 1918 left him anxious for a chance to restore Germany's military reputation. Hauser's command of the 7th Army was a poisoned chalice. It was already in a parlous state after a month of desperate defense in Normandy, and in the subsequent retreat through the Falaise-Argentan Gap suffered more losses in men and material. Hauser was one of those who managed to get away, riding to safety on a Panther tank, but he was badly wounded and had to relinquish his command. Hauser, who appeared as a witness for the defense at the Nuremberg trials, was a long-term survivor of the Second World War. He was 92 when he died in 1972.
Treat yourself to the best gift in history this holiday season. Enjoy unlimited access to award-winning podcasts and thousands of hours of original history documentaries released weekly exclusively on History Hit. There are topics for all history lovers, from Pompeii to D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description for an exclusive discount. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to explore the past like never before with History Hit.
The strategy of the Allies after the breakout from Normandy was complete on the 31st of July 1944 was to converge on the Germans as they attempted to escape from France through the gap between Argentan and Falaise. If the Allies could eliminate the main German armies in France, it would serve as a virtual death blow, removing them from the scene as the Allies advanced towards the German border and invaded the fatherland itself. The Allied forces certainly seemed capable of such a feat. By the 1st of August, the US Third Army had been unveiled, General George Patton commanding. The Third Army formed part of the new US 12th Army Group, commanded by General Omar Bradley, which also included the First Army, led by the taciturn Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges. Patton's force took up position on the right of the Allied line. The British were on the left, comprising the 21st Army Group, which had been expanded to include Lieutenant General Henry Creerer's Canadian First Army. To the Canadians' right was the British Second Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey. With military power of these proportions against a critically decimated German army, there was talk that the Second World War in Europe could be over before 1944 came to an end. The gap between Argentan and Falaise was the obvious exit from France, and the German 7th and 5th Army, formerly Panzergruppe West, headed for it, hoping to elude the Allied pincer movement that was about to build up against them. The best the Germans could do now was somehow fight their way through before the Allies closed the gap. Top German commanders were pessimistic about their prospects, but among the lower ranks, who probably knew less about their real situation, hope was not yet lost. Some faint hearts had deserted, more than 1,600 were executed in 1944, but others still had faith in the brilliance of their leaders and their own fighting spirit. It was not impossible either that the Germans could count on further mistakes by the Allies, the same mistakes that had already plagued their assaults on Caen. Allied strategy around Caen had proved both faulty and costly, and there was too a strange torpor afflicting some of their units which reduced their battle effectiveness. On paper, therefore, it seemed as if the decimated German defence had little chance. On the ground, the picture was not quite so dark as this might suggest. Even before the D-Day landings in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, the Allied commanders had come to believe that wherever Allied forces met the Germans in anything like equal strength, the Germans were going to prevail. It followed from this that to triumph in Normandy, the Allies must create the most favourable conditions possible for their forces. These conditions depended in the main on the overwhelming size of the invading armies and the vastly superior numbers of their weapons. In this rather nervous scenario, the Allies would have to swamp their way to success, or not succeed at all. However, by July 1944, the steady, if slow, build-up of Allied capability in France was creating the mammoth military strength the scenario required. Already by the end of June, 875,000 Allied troops, 150,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of stores had arrived in Normandy, and replacements exceeded casualties by over 17,000 fresh troops. There was now no question that the Allies and the Germans would meet on the basis of equality, even if Allied dominance of the air were not included in the equation. The American Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, wingspan 103 feet, was a giant among the Allied aircraft of the Second World War. When first introduced in June 1939, the B-17 was the world's most advanced heavy bomber and became the most predominant used by the United States between 1942 and 1945. The 1939 model had to be upgunned several times and fitted with extra armour to become equal to the challenge of the German Luftwaffe. This requirement produced the final Flying Fortress variant, the B-17G, and 8,630 were delivered to the United States Army Air Force in Europe by April 1945, when production ceased. The B-17G Flying Fortress was manned by between 6 and 10 aircrew. Powered by 4 1,200 horsepower Wright Cyclone engines, the bomber could reach a maximum speed of 287 miles an hour and had a ceiling of 35,000 feet. With a full bomb load of 12,800 pounds, the Flying Fortress's range was 1,100 miles. For defense, the bomber carried 13 half-inch machine guns, some of them sighted in the front turret. The flamethrower was one of the horror weapons of the war, capable of engulfing and incinerating an enemy, his position, and everything else within a range of about 50 yards or more. By their very nature, flamethrowers rarely inflicted the sort of light injury that would enable an enemy to continue fighting. Under flamethrower fire, the enemy was more likely to be severely disabled by burns and too agonized to fight back. Initially, flamethrowers served different uses for the British and Americans. The Germans had already used these weapons in their Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940, and the British Expeditionary Force in Western Europe was well aware of their punishing potential. The Americans, on the other hand, realized very early what fanatical enemies the Japanese were in the Pacific, always willing to die rather than surrender, and fighting in a fashion tantamount to suicide. In the Pacific theater, the flamethrower was used against Japanese pillboxes and blockhouses. In this context, the flamethrower was less of a direct fighting weapon, more of a shortcut to avoid the slaughter that would ensue if the Japanese were allowed to deploy their full strength in more conventional warfare. Most flamethrowers used in the Second World War were portable one-man weapons. Their range was, of course, limited, but the recompense was the flamethrower's awesome effectiveness. The British 3-inch mortar and the American 81mm mortar were basically the same thing. The mortar was a fairly simple 3-inch caliber weapon requiring a 3-man team, one to carry the short stubby barrel, another to carry the base plate, the third carrying the bipod, which was adjustable, all in addition to several 3-round ammunition carriers. The mortar, which had a characteristic thud when in action, was percussion fired and had to be reloaded for each shot. After 7 weeks of near-suicidal defense, German military capability in France was on the brink of collapse. By mid-July 1944, the Germans had lost over 96,000 men, but had received only 5,200 to replace them. They'd lost 225 tanks, with only 17 received. Whole regiments had virtually ceased to exist. The remnants of 4 of them made up a battle group within the 2nd Parachute Corps, whose manpower stood at no more than 3,400 riflemen. The elite Panzergruppe division was reduced to 40 tanks and just over 2,000 men. This paltry strength was weakened still further after 1,500 bombers of the 8th US Army Air Force bombed the Panzergruppe's positions. The raid took place on the 24th of July, in bad visibility, and several bombs fell on American frontline troops. Even so, the Panzergruppe was virtually wiped off the face of the battlefield. Almost all its remaining tanks were lost, and barely 700 of its men survived. Essentially, the German 7th Army in France had been reduced to scratch formations, and all they had to back them up were 4 battalions of the 275th Division, all of them weak and hardly capable of holding back the onslaught of the Allies. The Jagdpanther tank destroyer was an amalgam of 2 extremely powerful weapons. The mighty PaK-43 88mm gun was mounted on the basic chassis of a Panther tank, complete with its original powertrain and lower hull. The Jagdpanther, which had an MG-34 machine gun at the front, weighed more than 100,000 pounds and was capable of a maximum 28 miles per hour. armour was up to 4 inches thick. The Jagdpanther was a late development in German weaponry of the Second World War. It became available only just in time for the Germans to oppose the D-Day landings in June 1944. By that time, the German armaments industry was already so hard-pressed that it could produce only 382 Jagdpanthers before the war came to an end in 1945. But although comparatively few in number, the Jagdpanther had a deadly effect on the Allied armour in Normandy. The Jagdpanther could manoeuvre with ease across most types of terrain, though the Normandy bocage, with its network of small fields surrounded by thick hedgerows, considerably reduced its effectiveness. But then that applied to all tanks and self-propelled artillery that ventured in this tortuous maze. But in favourable terrain, the Jagdpanther could stand off beyond the reach of most Allied tank guns. Firing from close to 1,100 yards distance, the Jagdpanther was able to destroy Allied tanks virtually at leisure. German hand grenades were mainly designed to kill by exploding on or close to their targets. Unlike Allied grenades, there was only minimal fragmentation, so that hot and deadly fragments were not expelled by the blast when the grenade blew up. The Steyl Handgranat 24, the S-24, was a grenade of this type. It was primed by unscrewing the base and pulling on the detonation cord attached to a wooden stick. It was relatively simple to use and had a particularly effective pin mechanism. The S-24 measured around 16 inches in length. It weighed around 14 ounces and contained just under 6 ounces of explosive. This grenade was an adaptation of the stick hand grenade 23, called the potato masher by the Allied troops. The furtive nature of anti-personnel mines has always made them a much feared weapon, and minefields were extensively sown by the Germans during the Battle of Normandy. When the British and Canadians captured northern Caen, they found it was alive with mines, and the area remained dangerous for some time before they were cleared away. The S-Mine 35 was one of the Germans' smaller mines, 5 inches in height and 4 inches in diameter. Within its hidden casing, the S-35 concealed up to 18 ounces of TNT, with a firing load of 360 steel balls. It could be activated in several ways, either by a pressure trigger, or by tripwires, or by firing it electrically. Before blowing up, the S-35 would jump between 3 and 5 feet into the air by means of a propellant charge. In order to render the S-35 harmless, the tripwires had to be cut and the igniters neutralized. Then the plugs were removed so that the mine could be disarmed by removing the detonator. On the 15th of July 1944, Erwin Rommel warned Hitler that the moment was fast approaching when the hard-pressed German defences would crack. The moment arrived 10 days later, on the 25th of July. Delayed by rain, low cloud and bad visibility, Operation Cobra at last got off the ground, although it stuttered rather than leapt into life with a preliminary raid that hit the American forward positions. Over 100 GIs were killed, and nearly 500 others were injured. Nevertheless, the prestigious Panzerlehr division was all but destroyed, and the way was open for a full-scale Allied advance. The raid provoked the customary blaze of artillery from the German defenders, who gave their performance more credit than it was due. When the friendly fire from their own air force made the Americans hastily vacate their positions, the Germans presumed that they were withdrawing in the face of their guns. Meanwhile, there had been another distraction. Another attack was launched on the 25th of July, Operation Spring, a British and Canadian effort against the German forces south of Caen. The Germans responded quickly and forcefully. The 1st and 9th SS Panzer Divisions hit back so hard that within 24 hours the attack had to be called off. Operation Spring was, of course, a sideshow, but the Germans got the impression that it was the main Allied onslaught. This was not surprising, considering the parlous state of their intelligence and their poor communications. But while the Germans were occupied with Spring, Cobra gained unexpected time to get going before they realized their mistake. The delay proved invaluable, clearing the ground of appreciable opposition. On the 25th of July, the US 7th Corps had pushed more than 2 miles into the German positions. On the 26th, US 8th Corps had joined in and the Germans were pushed back a further 4 miles. These successes set up the conditions for the US 2nd Armoured Division, known as the Hell on Wheels Division, to break through into open country on the 27th of July. The next day, the US 7th Corps reached Coutances. By then, the Germans had at last realized what was happening and switched the 2nd and 17th SS Divisions to pose a threat to the Americans' flank. But it was too late. The Germans succeeded in blocking the way into Coutances for a few hours, but by the evening they'd been driven off, and the Americans were in possession. On the 30th of July, General Patton's Third Army seized the important road junction at Avranches and the southern extent of the Cotentin Peninsula. By this time, Allied forces had advanced 37 miles, covering more ground in 6 days than in the whole of the previous 7 weeks. The Normandy countryside that now lay before the Americans was a very welcome sight. At last they were out of the bocage, that obstructive maze where even their Rhino tanks equipped with blades for cutting through the hedgerows, had managed only minimal progress. By the 2nd of August, the Americans were also presented with a sweep of open country 5 miles wide at Avranches, where a gap was being held open for them by Allied air forces and armour. 4 divisions of Patton's Third Army passed through Avranches on the 3rd of August, cleared the bocage, and emerged onto the plains of Normandy. They encountered no serious resistance. The German defences had broken, just as Rommel predicted they would. More than that, the 7th Army was disintegrating into small, scattered battle groups, some no bigger than battalion size. Columns of men were wandering the countryside, looking for a way out. Most of the Germans were short of ammunition, especially for their anti-tank guns. Tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned by the roadside. The Germans were constantly hammered from the air and sustained enormous casualties. By the 6th of August 1944, they'd lost more than 144,000 men, and replacements, when they managed to get through, numbered less than 20,000. It was a scene of chaos and despair, but as so often happened with the Germans, it was not the whole story. Where they were able to regroup and mount a defence, even where they could mobilise only a few tanks, they could still impede the Allied advance. It seemed impossible that they could turn it back, and the Allies tended to take that for granted. But it was unwise, just as it was 4 months later in the Ardennes, when the Americans were surprised by a last-ditch armoured offensive. The Führer still hoped to transform German fortunes in Normandy with a brilliant last-minute strike, and however pessimistic their own views, his commanders were still duty-bound to try to make Hitler's dreams come true. On the 3rd of August, Hitler ordered a counterattack, Operation Lüttich, to take place at Avranches 3 days later. The purpose of Lüttich was to isolate the US Third Army, turn north and crush the Normandy beachhead. This was, of course, unduly, even criminally ambitious. The Germans had to scrape together the required forces from what remained of 5 panzer divisions. Between them, they had only 185 tanks, and their mobile armoured attack would inevitably attract attention from Allied planes. Erwin Rommel, who knew about such things, would never have approved, but at the time he was out of action and out of favour, He was under suspicion for complicity in the July bomb plot to kill Adolf Hitler. Hitler's acquaintance with military realities had always been shaky, and no one else seriously believed in the success of the counterattack. But it was dangerous to gainsay the Führer. Lüttich went ahead. The German assault would begin at Mortain, which had been captured by the US 7th Corps, and the positions to be targeted were those of the 30th US Division. Hitler's purpose was to split the American forces in two, seize control of the road network around Mortain, and then drive on to the coast. However, the ultra codebreakers were intercepting the German radio transmissions and warned the Allied commanders of the German plans. The panzers managed to capture Mortain, but it was of no use to them without control of the road junctions to the north, which were blocked by the Americans at l'Abbé Blanche. The strategic Hill 314, sited on the high ground east of Mortain, also eluded the Germans. The hill remained in the hands of the US 30th Division, who used it to plaster the Germans with artillery fire. But the Germans were undeterred by difficulties. They kept on attacking Hill 314, and at one point an SS officer presented the Americans with a surrender ultimatum. The Americans declined to accept. This refusal was answered by even more vigorous attacks, in which several American foxholes were overrun. In the bitter fighting that followed, the Americans on Hill 314 had to call on their artillery for rescue. But the sound and fury of the German assaults were hollow, and their successes were short-lived. The Americans sent out tanks to hunt down their infantry, and early on the 7th of August, Allied fighter bombers arrived and pounded them so heavily that half their tanks were destroyed. Next, a 5-mile advance by the panzers into the American lines came to an ignominious end when they ran out of fuel. The German armor took so much punishment that they had only 8 of their 88mm tank guns left. Field Marshal Kluge and Colonel General Hauser were so appalled at the wastage that they dared to protest when Hitler ordered the panzers to remain in position on the 9th of August. As usual, protest proved useless. Hitler issued orders for a further attack on the 11th of August in the direction of Avranches, 20 miles west of Mortain. For this purpose, all available German armor was to be concentrated on a new formation, Panzergruppe Eberbach, General Hans Eberbach commanding. The new group comprised the scratchings of those forces that had been able to survive. But the German attack at Mortain had valuable uses for the Allies. The doomed German attack at Mortain fitted very neatly into General Montgomery's plan to envelop and trap the enemy between Argentan and Falaise. The Germans had been ordered not to retreat from Mortain, and this placed them just where Montgomery wanted them. On the 6th of August, Montgomery issued a directive that required the Canadian First Army to attack towards Falaise and then turn east towards the River Seine. Meanwhile, the British Second Army would move towards Argentan and also turn east. The American 12th Army was ordered to continue its eastward advance and then head for Paris. The German counterattack at Mortain and their subsequent failure to retreat while there was still time meant that the whole of their Army Group B, the remnants of the force assigned to defend Normandy, stood between the jaws of Montgomery's trap. The encirclement was amended on the 8th of August when Patton's 15th Corps was ordered to Alenion to cover the southern sector of the trap. 3 days later, the Canadians received new orders to capture both Falaise and Argentan, while the 12th US Army Group completed the entrapment by advancing to Argentan. On paper, it all appeared straightforward, but as so often happened with the Germans, the reality on the ground was different. Instead of enclosing and mopping up a depleted and dispirited enemy, the Allies found themselves fiercely resisted. One of the Germans' great strengths was their ability to switch armor, guns, and men from one place in immediate danger to the next, and to do it quickly. This strategy had succeeded several times already, and now it was going to succeed again. Operation Totalize, the Canadian advance on Falaise, began on the 7th of August, but became bogged down 4 days later. The Canadians' reserves and the 1st Polish Armoured Division were fighting their first battle, and they proved unequal to the task of either capturing Falaise or driving through to Argenton to meet up with the Americans. By the 11th of August, when the Canadians came to a halt, they were only halfway to Falaise after an advance of 9 miles. The American 15th Corps, which included the 2nd French Armoured Division, had little difficulty in reaching Argenton, where they waited impatiently for the Canadians to catch up. The Canadians' next attempt, Operation Tractable, went in on the morning of the 14th of August, and this time they managed to break through to Falaise to take up positions 12 miles north of the Americans. However, valuable time had been lost. Now a huge pocket was formed with the German 7th Army, the 5th Panzer Army and Panzergruppe Eberbach inside it. The only exit was at Falaise, and on the 13th of August, in a typically aggressive gesture, General Patton had tried to persuade General Bradley to let him close the gap by driving his 15th Corps north of Argenton. Bradley refused. The Allied line was too thinly stretched for him to risk a German strike against both ends. Bradley preferred to wait until troops of the 1st US Army arrived at Argenton to take over the position of the 15th Corps. Bradley was not alone in his caution. Most of the Allied commanders, except for the fiery Patton, were somewhat awed by German military tactics, which were admittedly superior. This was particularly true when their skills were likely to be exercised in as tight a corner as the Falaise Gap. The Allies also went in dread of inflicting an unacceptable casualty rate on their own forces. Add to that a lack of experience in conducting a large encirclement, and these inhibitions were going to limit the success the Allies were able to achieve at Falaise. There was, of course, no question that the Germans were going to hold the Falaise pocket. The point was how much of their decimated, exhausted army and remaining armour would be able to escape. All the Germans could do before the inevitable collapse was to hold on to every yard of ground. On the 15th of August, a German tank screen brought an advance by Canadian armour to a halt. The 3rd Canadian Division was forced to withdraw from the village of Solangui by a spirited German counterattack. The 2nd Canadian Division had better luck near Falaise. The Germans pulled back, allowing them to reach positions about a mile away. From there, the Canadians drove into the town, where the last-ditch style of the German defence was once again typified by a handful of Hitler Youth from the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend Division. Outside, there were about 100 men of the Mount Royal Fusiliers with anti-tank guns, mortars and Bren carriers. At the end, the Fusiliers took only 4 prisoners. The rest were all dead. Falaise itself was a sea of ruin and rubble so extensive that it was impossible to make out where the streets had been. Bulldozers set to work clearing up the mess. Several hours passed before bulldozers were able to clear paths for the Canadian vehicles. The previous day, Field Marshal von Kluge informed Army headquarters that holding the gap at Falaise was impossible. This time, and at long last, Adolf Hitler saw sense and agreed to a retreat. But he dismissed von Kluge, whom he suspected not only of complicity in the July bomb plot, but of negotiating with the Allies behind his back. Von Kluge was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model, who found himself in charge not of an army, but of a rabble, avid to get away from the killing fields of Normandy. Time for escape was now running very short. On the 17th of August, the 2nd Canadian Corps and the US 5th Corps made advances that reduced the exit from the Falaise pocket to just a few thousand yards. The Germans fought desperately to prevent it shrinking further. At the village of Saint-Lambert on the 19th of August, Canadian infantry duelled all morning with the German defenders, who forced them to dig in. The Germans mounted successive counterattacks, so the Canadians would not prevent them keeping open the route for their escape eastwards. The Germans were being helped from an unusual quarter. Elsewhere, the advance by Canadian and Polish troops was agonizingly, inexplicably slow, despite frantic urgings from Montgomery and Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, commander of the Canadian Second Corps. The Allied air forces hammered the German infantry, and tanks now pouring through the still open gap. Allied fighter bombers flew up to 3,000 sorties a day, and the slaughter and destruction were immense. But still, the Falaise Gap remained open, and still the fleeing Germans surged through, despite the deadly gauntlet they had to run. The Poles had seized the high ground at Montormel and set up machine gun positions from which they blasted down fire on the Germans passing below. They called up artillery to pound columns of German vehicles as they drove by. The Canadians, meanwhile, fired at every group of Germans they could see. The Germans were scattered, running in ones and twos from the shelter of one wood to the next. Some were picked off quickly. Some fell to the ground but managed to run on. Some lay injured, unable to continue. Some simply gave up and hoisted white flags. But by then, the ground was littered with corpses and the hulks of smoking, ruined tanks and vehicles. The gap between Argentan and Falaise was finally closed on the 21st of August, when the Canadians and the Poles linked up at Coudard. The 3rd and 4th Canadian Division managed to capture Saint-Lambert after 2 days of ferocious combat, and the US 90th Division secured Chambord. 4 days later, Paris was liberated by the 2nd French Armoured Division. All of it should have happened earlier, and the reasons why it didn't have been subject to dispute ever since. The nature of the fighting in Normandy between the 25th of July and the 21st of August 1944 seemed inexplicable. The German forces were in a state of collapse. They were outnumbered and outgunned. They had no air cover and were constantly hammered by the Allied air forces. Their intelligence was poor and their communications were faulty. Adolf Hitler, their supreme commander, issued orders no responsible military man would ever have contemplated. By rights, the Allies should have been able to flick away their resistance and surge on into Germany with little or no difficulty. Yet it did not happen. How was this possible? The depressing fact was that in all the essentials of war, the German forces were superior. When it came to tactics, German commanders were more skilled and more adept at making the most of their resources. Their men were better motivated, better led, better trained, much more determined, and far more willing to sacrifice themselves for their cause. Among the Allied forces, only the Russians displayed the same urge to fight to the death. By the time the battle for Normandy ended at Falaise, the Germans were being hunted down all over France. The remnants of the German 7th Army were in full retreat, heading for the bridges across the River Seine. Following the invasion of southern France on the 15th of August, the German 9th Army was withdrawing in disorder up the valley of the River Rhône. In a bold, Patton-style initiative, troops of the American 6th Corps under General Lucien Truscott managed to overtake the Germans and trap them at Montélimar on the east bank of the Rhône on the 22nd of August. But Truscott was thwarted 6 days later. The 2nd Panzers counterattacked and did better than their counterparts at Falaise. They kept the escape route open long enough for most of the German forces to get away. However, they did leave behind 15,000 prisoners, and some 4,000 of their tanks and other vehicles were destroyed. This, though, was not an escape to safety. The French resistance, avid for revenge after 4 years of brutal occupation, sought and savoured every opportunity to kill, torture, or mutilate all the Boche they could find. Whole units of German soldiers wandered around looking for Allied troops to whom they could surrender. Only the haven of captivity could protect them from the fury of the French. Meanwhile, in the west, far from any chances of getting out of France, isolated German garrisons held out at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Rochelle, and in the estuary of the Gironde. Brest surrendered after a long siege on the 18th of September 1944, and the rest a few months later, except for Lorient, which remained in German hands until the end of the war. The garrisons had stayed in place on Hitler's orders, but it was a futile gesture. They were nothing but specks left over from a once mighty force that had overrun and occupied France since 1940, and the zest of that triumph had long since faded. The major pursuit, of course, was in northeastern France, where the Allies were chasing their quarry towards the West Wall, the fortifications popularly known as the Siegfried Line that protected the western border of Germany. The British and Americans were still in pursuit well into September, but this was creating its own problems. The further the Allied forces were from the Normandy coast, the longer their supply lines became, and a fresh campaign would be needed to shift the Germans from more convenient ports on the Belgian coast. Meanwhile, the German forces that managed to elude the Allies' clutches had a chance to dig themselves in behind the West Wall. The fortifications, popularly known as the Siegfried Line, were 3 miles deep and had been built after 1938 to protect the western border of Germany. In 1944, reserves were rushed to the West Wall as the survivors of Normandy dug themselves in. They were in a similar state to the wall itself, battered, dilapidated, feeble. But their discipline and their will to fight was still intact, and their leadership, headed by Field Marshal von Rundstedt, was of high quality. If Normandy were anything to go by, the Allies were in for yet another costly struggle, and the war was still a long way from its end. In the Allied plans for the invasion of Normandy, the capture of Caen was the natural next step after the initial landings on D-Day, the 6th of June 1944. Caen, lying 10 miles from the coast, was supposed to be taken on this first day, but it proved to be 10 miles too far for the troops of the British Second Army and the 3rd Canadian Division, whose task it was to take the town. The British started out too late from the landing beaches in the afternoon, and even more crucially, they had to leave their tanks behind. The British armour was jammed up in the mass of vehicles that were crowding the invasion beaches. This, though, was only the start of the difficulties. When, at last, the tanks managed to move inland, they found that the Normandy countryside seemed to be conspiring against them. The bocage, or box country, close to Caen certainly lived up to its name, with its checkerboard of small fields surrounded by hedgerows and narrow, twisting lanes. The Allied troops had been trained for fast, mobile warfare, but now found themselves embroiled in obstructive terrain, which slowed their progress to a crawl. Worse still, the delay had allowed the bulk of the German armour to move into place and block the way to Caen. From there, the Germans proceeded to put up a ferocious defence that startled the Allies. It seemed impossible that the Germans could resist in such strength and with such vigour at this late stage in the war. At sea, the time when German U-boats had terrorized the Atlantic convoys, bringing vital supplies to Britain, was a thing of the past. By 1943, the predators had become the prey of vastly improved convoy defences. At home, German war industries had been heavily bombed, and their capacity so severely reduced that production could no longer keep pace with the losses suffered on the fighting fronts. The much-vaunted Luftwaffe, which rode the skies of continental Europe virtually unchallenged early on in the war, had become a parody of its former glory. After the Battle of Britain in 1940, when it failed before the RAF, the first modern air force it encountered, the Luftwaffe was never the same again. In Russia, there were early successes, but too much Luftwaffe strength was later bled away in combat with the improving Russian Air Force. By the eve of the Normandy landings, a mere 400 aircraft were all the Luftwaffe could bring to the battle, against 30 times that number of Allied fighters and bombers. Also, Allied bombing of airfields and installations, as well as losses in the air, saw to it that the Luftwaffe was effectively neutralized. After D-Day, the occasional Luftwaffe squadron, 50 aircraft or so, made its appearance in the skies over Normandy. But it was the Allies who held the advantage that most mattered: total command of the air. The year 1943 had already prefigured the ultimate fate of the German war effort. The surrender of General Paulus and his decimated 6th Army at Stalingrad had been a crippling psychological as well as military blow. Stalingrad proved to be the first step in an inexorable withdrawal that saw the Germans pushed out of Russia, into Poland, and over Germany's eastern border. The prestigious Africa Corps suffered final defeat in North Africa. From there, the Allies went on to conquer Sicily. Next, they invaded Italy, which surrendered at once and went over to the Allied side. The Germans had known all along that one day the Allies would assault Adolf Hitler's Fortress Europe. Keeping them out had been the purpose of the mighty Atlantic Wall that stretched along the north and west coasts of France down to the Spanish border. But where would they strike? An Allied campaign of deception, suggesting invasion sites in Norway, central Italy, the eastern Mediterranean, the Pas-de-Calais, and elsewhere in France, had left the Germans so thoroughly confused that they did not know for certain where to expect the attack until the Allied invasion fleet appeared off the Normandy coast. Once the Allies managed to get ashore and started moving off the beaches, the importance of Caen came into focus. Lying on the left bank of the River Orne, southwest of Le Havre, Caen was at one and the same time a vital linchpin of the German defences and a crucial target for the Allies. The only town among the myriad villages in this part of France, Caen dominated the undulating plains on which it stood and was the hub of 12 major roads and a vital railway centre. If they could hold Caen, the Germans had the chance to confine the invaders close to the Normandy beaches and then throw them back into the English Channel. On the other hand, if the Allies could take Caen, the way would be open to the rest of France and eastwards into Nazi Germany itself. There were no two ways about it. The fight for Caen was going to be make or break for both sides. Already by the end of D-Day, the Allied commanders in charge of capturing Caen had been shown what a difficult task it was going to be. In theory, it might have been even more difficult, because the two men in overall command, US General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and the British General Bernard Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group, were such totally different characters. The fact that Eisenhower and Montgomery managed to work together was a tribute to the Americans' extraordinary tact and forbearance. As was rather overemphasized at the time, Eisenhower was a desk general, an organizer and a strategist rather than a warrior. He'd spent his career in relative obscurity, yet in 1942 he was chosen out of 336 other senior officers as the candidate best suited to place in overall command of the Allied invasion of Europe. Eisenhower was to need all his powers to mollify, mediate and persuade when it came to dealing with Montgomery. The British general was prickly, willful, vain, insensitive and overbearing. He had a much criticized tendency to claim the plans of others as his own, and at times took more credit for victories than was due to him. At the same time, Montgomery was an outstanding military leader, with a record in the war that few, if any, other Allied commander could match. Montgomery had already proved his caliber during the evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940, and in the brilliant series of victories in the desert of North Africa that began with El Alamein in 1942. Yet he was also capable of making unwise choices. Later on, in September 1944, he clashed with Eisenhower and the Americans over their broad front strategy and the narrow front, the single thrust into northern Germany, which he preferred. If Montgomery had had his way, US General Patton's Third Army would have been robbed of supplies and support. Eisenhower put his foot down, and the broad front strategy prevailed. This, though, was not the first time Montgomery's tactics were called into question. 3 months earlier, his plans for capturing Caen became the subject of serious criticism. General Montgomery and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of German Army Group B, and his opposite number on the German side, were established rivals by the time their forces met in Normandy. They'd already faced each other in North Africa, where Rommel's dynamic style and talent for daring innovation had attracted the respect of his British opponents. At home in Germany, Rommel was tailor-made to be a war hero. Not only was he immensely likable, but the dominance in the desert he enjoyed until late 1942, and the way he consistently outwitted the British, generated great excitement in Germany. The desert was pure battlefield, with few if any civilians and no towns or even villages, and Rommel was well suited to the fluid, fast-moving warfare this allowed him. But Normandy was completely different. Much more constricted, and even more importantly, much more under the control of Rommel's own supreme commander, Adolf Hitler. Hitler had never been all that keen on the Desert War. The main reason he allowed it to continue was Rommel's popularity and the enthusiasm for the war it created at home. Rommel, however, had an invaluable trait for a Führer who always suspected men of ambition. He was a military commander, pure and simple, and had no yearnings for political power. If anything, he was politically naive, and that suited Hitler fine. Even so, it was a serious weakness for the German cause in Normandy to have military strategy in the hands of an incompetent like Hitler, who paid more attention to his own fancies than he paid to his commanders on the ground. Hitler's lack of military nous had already been responsible for the disaster that overtook the German armies in Russia. Rommel himself had been hampered in North Africa by the lack of military support Hitler had allowed him. Hitler knew nothing of the principles of strategic withdrawal and how it preserved forces to fight and possibly win another day. His answer to untenable situations was that Germans must never retreat, but fight to the last man. It was little wonder that the Führer was the despair of his generals, who had to follow orders, however impossible, and go on fighting battles and eventually a war they could not win. Rommel's glowing reputation preserved him from dismissal, Hitler's usual response to protest, but he was not spared the other drawbacks created by the Führer's scenario for Normandy. Once the Normandy landings had succeeded, the next task for the German defenders was to stop the Allies expanding the beachheads and, above all, prevent them from reaching Caen. It was clear that Caen was the next and logical target when a heavy air raid by 600 aircraft of the 8th US Army Air Force struck the town at 1500 hours on D-Day. Caen was transformed into ashes and smoking rubble. Meanwhile, out at sea, Allied ships shelled the town, adding to the destruction. However, the delay experienced by the British in setting out from the coast to attack Caen was extremely fortunate for the Germans. It gave them valuable time to organize an iron ring of defenses around the town. The Germans put 3 divisions in place to form a screen around Caen: the 21st Division, the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend Division, and the Panzerlehr. Their orders were to hold the line at all costs and put up such a barrage of fire that the British and the Canadians, who advanced towards Caen on the 7th of June, would find it impossible to penetrate. General Montgomery's strategy for Caen was largely conditioned by the plan to take the town on D-Day. His forces, therefore, were going to make a frontal assault. This, Montgomery expected, would take them through to Caen and past the supposedly weak and ineffectual German defenses. Montgomery soon learned otherwise, as the fury of the German resistance began to decimate his forces. This led to a speedy change of plan, to something more subtle and hopefully less costly. On the 9th of June, Montgomery conferred with Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey and US General Omar Bradley. They agreed that instead of a head-on assault, Caen would be enveloped, with the British Second Army keeping up pressure on the town, while pushing towards Villers-Bocage, Évrecy, and then on southeast towards Falaise. Pressurizing Caen in this fashion would also serve to divert German attention from American efforts to capture the important port of Cherbourg. By coincidence, the same day, Lieutenant General Leopold von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzergruppe West, unveiled a new plan of his own, a concerted push in which the 3 divisions shielding Caen would hit out at the Allied forces, and after the plan was amended by Rommel, recapture Bayeux from the British. What neither side could realize was that their plans cancelled each other out, with only one possible result: a direct clash all along the battle line. On paper, the balance of military capability in Normandy seemed to favour the Allies. However, in war, any war, it is not necessarily the most mightily equipped or the most numerous side that prevails. Military capability depends on many more factors than this. The British and Canadian forces who opened the battle for Caen in the first week after D-Day were certainly well trained and well equipped, and their morale was high. Even though the Canadian troops were inexperienced, they drew extra motivation from the fact that they were volunteers rather than conscripts. Unlike the Germans, the Allied troops belonged to a force headed by a unified command, with Allied dominance in the air to protect them, and a strong, if slow, build-up of men and armaments to reinforce them. These were important advantages, and ultimately they were crucial. However, among the Allied commanders there was a belief, endorsed by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, that there were situations in which the Germans outclassed their opponents. Wherever Allied forces confronted the Germans in anything like equal strength, the Germans normally prevailed. Just how frequent that equality would be was an unanswered question as the battle for Caen got underway. On the Allied side in Normandy, the predominant tank was the American Sherman M4. A vast number of Shermans, 49,320, were constructed after production began in 1942, making it the most abundant tank ever known. Compared to the British and some German tanks, the Sherman's speed was high, 26 miles per hour, though at 31 millimeters, the thickness of its armor fell below that of most rivals. The Sherman, which weighed up to 32 tons and was powered by a 500 horsepower petrol engine, carried a 76mm main gun, backed up by one 12.7mm and two 7.62mm machine guns, and a 2-inch mortar. It had a range of 100 miles and a fully transversible turret. There were drawbacks, though. The Sherman's profile was vulnerably high, and its armor was too weak to withstand much of the Germans' anti-tank fire. It was virtually helpless before the deadly German 88. After the critical loss of British armour and weapons suffered at Dunkirk in 1940, a replacement for the Matilda II tank was urgently needed. The first Churchill tanks were available within the year, by June 1941, but it took another 12 months to sort out the inevitable teething troubles. However, by March 1942, the 6-pounder gun was at last available to replace the less than effective 2-pounder carried by the first Churchills. After a disastrous debut during the raid of Dieppe in 1942, when the Churchills became trapped on the shingle beach, the tanks went on to prove their ability, particularly the ability to climb hills, in the North African campaign. Their maximum 102mm armour also proved relatively impervious to German anti-tank fire. The Churchills, which carried the 6-pounder main gun and two 7.92mm machine guns, were somewhat on the slow side, with a maximum speed of just over 15 miles an hour. In the air over Normandy, the most daunting sight for the Germans was a flight of Allied fighter bombers prowling the daylight skies, looking for targets which, more often than not, they destroyed. This was why the Germans soon resorted to moving by night. One of the most prominent of the fighter bombers was the British Hawker Typhoon, which earned special fame in the latter stages of the war as a tank buster. The Typhoon started life as a fighter, but it tended to falter at high speeds, and its Sabre engine proved unreliable. As a result, the Typhoon suffered too many accidents to continue for long in the fighter role. Towards the end of 1942, the Typhoon was restructured and equipped with a new 2,180 horsepower Napier Sabre engine. The new Typhoon possessed a maximum speed of 412 miles an hour, a flight ceiling of 32,500 feet, and a maximum range of 510 miles. It carried a 1,000-pound bomb load and 4 20mm cannon. After its makeover, the fighter bomber re-emerged to become the terror of Germans on the ground, and eventually formed the offensive spine of the 2nd Tactical Air Force in Europe. Though their bite was deadly, their numbers were relatively small. 3,030 Typhoons were manufactured between 1942 and 1945. The Germans were classed as the underdogs in the struggle for Caen, and the Allies tended to presume that their military capability was in the same state. They were certainly very serious problems. The German 7th Army in Normandy was overstretched. They were constantly harassed by the French resistance. Air cover from the Luftwaffe was virtually non-existent. Losses were difficult, sometimes impossible to replace. Allied air supremacy tortured the troops on the ground. On paper, the Germans seemed to have everything stacked against them. In fact, their military capability was much greater than this suggested. Many of the German commanders in the field were brilliant operational leaders, able to make the most effective use of their scarce resources. Some of them, like Major General Kurt Meyer, commander of the Hitlerjugend division, led from the front and personally inspired their men by their example. The long-standing German military tradition ensured that they were highly motivated, whatever the odds, and many of the German units comprised elite warriors who did not shrink from sacrificing themselves for fatherland and Führer. If anything, they embraced it and equated such sacrifice with glory. The Allies considered this attitude fanatical. To the Germans, it was no more than their duty. The German 88mm flak gun, much in evidence in the battles around Caen, was one of the most powerful and most feared guns of the Second World War. The 88 was originally designed for anti-aircraft service. However, when some of them were converted as anti-tank guns and showed their destructive paces in North Africa in 1941, the 88's reputation as a fearsome destroyer was made. Normandy was the perfect setting for the 88. The Normandy bocage offered maximum chances for a camouflaged 88 to lie in wait for opponents. It was the same at the many fortified villages in Normandy, where some of the 88s were sighted. When mounted on the Tiger tank, the very appearance of the 88 was startling. Allied troops described its 16-foot-long barrel as long as a telegraph pole. This unusual length made the muzzle velocity of the 88 extremely punishing. Firing at 85 degrees elevation, the 88 used armor-piercing fused shells that moved at 886 yards per second. They could hit their targets and create firebursts at distances of up to 2,000 yards. An experienced crew was able to dismount the 88 and be ready for action in no more than 20 seconds, then remount the gun to move elsewhere in less than 60. The Tiger II, or Panzer VI, was the tank equivalent of the 88mm gun, which served as its main armament. Like the 88, the Tiger was a superior and much feared weapon. Because of the tank's exploits in Normandy, where 14 of them were used by the Panzer Lehr division, Allied troops came to believe that 3 Sherman or 4 Churchill tanks were needed to challenge 1 Tiger, and even then, the German tank would dispose of most, if not all of them. Designed as a heavy breakthrough tank to lead assaults by armored divisions, the Tiger II weighed a hefty 75 tons and was powered by a 692 horsepower engine with maximum speed of 24 miles an hour. It was capable of piercing armor 112 millimeters thick at 1,400 yards. The Tiger's own 110mm frontal armour rendered it impervious to most of the Allied tanks and artillery. The exception was the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, which appeared on the battlefield in North Africa a month before the Tigers arrived. Even the Russian T-34 had to close to just over 1,600 yards before it had a hope of penetrating the Tiger's armour. Understandably, Allied tank crews generally preferred to outmaneuver the Tiger rather than confront it and approach from its more vulnerable rear. Nebelwerfer, meaning smoke thrower, originally applied to the German chemical mortar. Later, the Nebelwerfer became a rocket launcher, specifically the 150mm 41 model, which had 6 launching tubes. Fired at ranges of up to 7,700 yards, the Nebelwerfer 41 launched its incendiary rockets in sequence to avoid being overturned by the blast. Meanwhile, the Nebelwerfer's crew had to shelter in a trench at least 15 yards away, as the rockets were fired electrically using a junction box. A full launch from the Nebelwerfer, including loading, took 90 seconds to complete. The sound was terrifying in itself, a high-pitched screeching. For the Allies, the Nebelwerfer was a truly deadly weapon. It was reckoned to have caused 3/4 of the casualties among the infantry. For the Germans, the Nebelwerfer helped them cope with the serious problem of infantry and artillery shortages in the latter part of the war. The Germans turned instead to massed Nebelwerfers, which were especially effective in putting up defensive fire. General Montgomery gave the task of capturing Caen to the British Second Army under Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey, who had at his disposal 3 armoured divisions, 7 independent armoured and tank brigades, 8 infantry divisions, and the Canadian First Corps. The infantry divisions consisted of some 18,400 men, combined from different regiments, together with an artillery brigade. An armoured division possessed around 286 tanks, mostly Sherman M4s, and Cromwell tanks, and some 15,000 men. Divisions were apportioned into 1 infantry brigade, which had 3 motorised battalions, and an armoured brigade of 3 battalions. There was also an infantry battalion which used half-tracks. Close support for the infantry was provided by Churchill tanks, and by special tanks of the 79th Armoured Division. Used by all sections of the British Second Army, these tanks were officially designated Special Purpose Vehicles, but because of their eccentricity, they acquired the nickname of Funnies. One of them was the flail tank, which was fitted with heavy chains on a revolving drum and proved very effective in clearing the landing beaches of mines. Another of the Funnies was the Churchill Crocodile, which featured a flame projector in place of the Hull machine guns. The role of the Funnies did not end with the Normandy landings. They were also used inland, where the Germans had sown a thick carpet of mines and other obstacles. Given the savagery of the German defence, eliminating their strong posts and pillboxes by flame was often the only way. On the 7th of June, the 185th Brigade received a first taste of just how savage this defence was. Attempting to force their way through Libisi, northwest of Caen, they soon found that their powerful supporting batteries were not enough to prevent them from suffering huge casualties. The brigade's assault ground to a halt. The 9th Brigade did somewhat better at Combe, which they captured after the Royal Ulster Rifles courted death by traversing nearly 1.5 miles of ground without cover. The Germans put up such a holocaust of fire that the Ulstermen suffered very heavy casualties, and the advance got no further. The 7th Army of Army Group B, whose task it was to defend Normandy, placed its strongest forces around Caen, leaving the coast to be protected by static divisions, filled in the main with men who were medically unfit, too old to fight, or prisoners from the Eastern Front who'd supposedly volunteered for service with the Wehrmacht. The 21st Panzers, the Panzerlehr, and the 12th SS Hitlerjugend divisions, which placed an iron ring of defences around Caen, were much more elite forces. They were infused with self-sacrificing loyalty and the resolve and skill to fend off the Allies no matter what the cost. One of these divisions, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, belonged to the Waffen-SS and comprised the most militarized teenagers in the world. Like the rest of the Waffen-SS, they were volunteers. Familiar with weapons since as early as the age of 6, the Hitler Youth had been reared for war and reveled in it. Despite, or perhaps because of, their extreme youth, the Hitlerjugend typified fanatical, last-ditch resistance more than any other German division in Normandy. Both the Hitlerjugend and the Panzerlehr had been thoroughly pounded by Allied air attack as they moved up towards Caen after D-Day. The Panzerlehr had left behind a trail of burned-out, bullet-ridden wrecks that included 130 trucks, 5 tanks, 84 guns, and the staff car belonging to its commander, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein. As an elite, however, the Panzerlehr had been given the most up-to-date equipment, including the incomparable Tiger II tanks and the Panther or Panzer Vs, which outclassed but did not replace the German Panzer IV tanks. The Hitlerjugend, whose full battle strength was 21,386 men, had always been treated as special. Later on in the Battle for Normandy, in mid-June, Adolf Hitler himself sought to preserve what was left of them by ordering their withdrawal. At that juncture, the parlous state of the Hitler Youth and the 2 other divisions displayed the grim truth about how they'd fought in the first week after D-Day, and what it had cost them. The fighting at Le Bicet and Combes on the 7th of June gave notice that the early battles for Caen were going to be struggles to the death. This set a pattern that was to be repeated in every ferocious encounter that took place around Caen over the next 7 days. On the morning of the 7th of June, the 9th Infantry Brigade Group, the forward troops of the 3rd Canadian Division, were advancing towards Carpiquet and its airfield, which was sited west of Caen. Meanwhile, behind them, more Canadian tanks were moving southwest from the direction of Bouron and headed for Auty. The Canadians passed through Auty and set out for Franqueville and Carpiquet. There was no apparent opposition, but it was there nevertheless. The progress of the Canadians had been observed all the way by the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division, which was under orders to hold their fire until the right moment. Major General Kurt Meyer, leader of the Hitlerjugend, chose his moment carefully. He waited for the Canadian tanks to pass through Franqueville and reach the point where they were just about to cross the road between Caen and Bayeux. Only then did he give the order to attack. Surprise was complete. Tanks were blown apart under close fire. The crews jumped out to save themselves, but ran into a hail of shot. Recovering, the Canadians returned fire, and a Panzer IV was hit. Flames funneled up out of its turret. Pushing through the smoke and thunder of combat, the Canadian infantry tried to force their way into Auty, only to find the Germans waiting for them. In the subsequent melee, the Germans seized control of Franqueville and Auty and started pushing back the Canadian forward units. The Canadians reeled under the impact, but the Germans didn't have it all their own way. Violent fighting raged all over the surrounding areas, and when the Hitlerjugend's 1st Battalion, which had been delayed by refueling problems, arrived in the suburbs of Combes, the Canadians were waiting for them with Sherman tanks and heavy machine guns. The Canadian artillery opened up, and Allied aircraft weighed in with punishing bombing and strafing runs. The Panzer IVs were outnumbered. They could do nothing to stop the Shermans, and eventually the Germans were forced to dig in. After the furor of battle died down and the cost was counted, the Canadians came off worst. They'd lost 245 casualties and 28 Sherman tanks. Although the Hitler Youth could congratulate themselves on their handling of the Canadian challenge, Kurt Meyer was not content to rest on these laurels. Early on the 8th of June, he ordered the 26th Regiment of the Hitlerjugend to advance across the railway line between Bayeux and Caen to tackle the 6th Canadian Armoured Regiment, which had captured Bretteville-Jaugeaus a few hours earlier. The Canadians were now poised to capture Carpiquet airfield, but the 26th Regiment got in the way and the airfield remained beyond reach. Meanwhile, the 7th Canadian Brigade came under heavy attack at Pouton-en-Bessin. This prompted a speedy counterattack, with the Canadians making mammoth efforts to retrieve their positions. At 08:30 hours on the 8th of June, Canadian infantry and tanks put up a wall of fire with heavy machine guns and artillery. The 26th Regiment was caught without anti-tank weapons and had to pull back to the nearby railway line. By nightfall, Puteaux was back in Canadian hands. The pattern was much the same at Rotte in the Mou Valley, close to the Caen-Bayeux road, where Germans and Canadians killed each other at point-blank range, at Nory-en-Bessin and Le Mesnil-Patry, in fact all over the battle area. Whichever side managed to advance did so through a storm of counter-attacking fire. Attacks halted, resumed, halted again. Gains were made, lost and retrieved. Here and there, tanks on fire blazed their flames into the summer sky. Some of the crew burned to death inside. Dead soldiers slumped in ditches or lay scattered across the fields. This attrition cost the Canadians nearly 3,000 casualties in the first week of the Normandy campaign. Afterwards, they consolidated the positions that had been so dearly won, but got no further. After 4 days, General Montgomery was forced to realize that assaulting Caen head-on was futile. The casualties had been too great, and Caen was no nearer to being captured. The solution would not be easy, especially when Montgomery's new plan for enveloping Caen, finalized on the 9th of June, coincided with a German offensive decided on the same day. In these mutually opposing strategies, the British 50th Division and the 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats, moving out of Bayeux to take Villers-Bocage, was going to be opposed by the Panzer-Lehr, advancing from Villers-Bocage against Bayeux. In the centre, the Hitlerjugend were to advance north of the Caen-Bayeux road, and the Canadian 3rd Division would do the same in the south. The British 51st Highland Division, advancing out of the bridgehead east of the River Orne, was going to encounter the 21st Panzer Division moving into it. General Montgomery, appalled by the losses suffered so far, desperately wanted to avoid more of the same. In the event, more of the same was inevitable. The Panzer-Lehr set off along the road to Bayeux, as ordered by Rommel. But they got within only 3 miles of the town when they were suddenly recalled. An emergency had suddenly arisen at Les Mesnil-Patry, a weak point in the German lines, where the Canadians were plastering the Hitlerjugend with ferocious crossfire. The Hitlerjugend, for their part, were answering back with heavy machine gun and mortar fire, and eventually the Canadians were forced to retire, leaving behind 37 tanks and 95 dead. As for Bayeux, on the 10th of June, the alternative German armour ordered to take the city ran into a powerful screen of Allied anti-tank fire and shelling from Royal Navy ships in the Channel. Bayeux remained in Allied hands. The Panzer-Lehr were now ordered to defend Tilly-sur-Seulles against the British 7th Armoured Division, which had advanced out of Bayeux. Tilly-sur-Seulles, which was already in ruins by the time the Panzer-Lehr arrived, lay in a valley to the southeast of Caen. This was no place for mobile warfare, and Fritz Bayerlein ordered his Panzergrenadier half-tracks to the rear. The Panzer-Lehr's tanks were then set up as mobile strongpoints, heavily camouflaged from view, with only a small section of turret showing. Care was taken to obscure the marks their tracks had made as they moved into position, so they wouldn't be spotted by Allied reconnaissance planes. The Germans, meanwhile, hid themselves in ditches or in the ruins of nearby houses and waited for the British 7th Armoured Division to bring the battle to them. When the fighting got underway, it soon resolved itself into a series of vicious skirmishes. German machine gun fire spat out of the copses. British anti-tank fire thundered at the German positions. There was the thud of mortars, the hiss of flamethrowers, and here and there the sharp sound of a single shot from a sniper. Every hedgerow, every ditch was a dangerous place for the British. Every innocent-looking cluster of branches and leaves a possible hideout for one of the deadly German 88s. But Tilly was also difficult and dangerous for the Germans. They were continually pounded by the Allied artillery, the naval bombardment, and by mortars. And the hard, stony ground offered only shallow dugouts for protection. Nevertheless, the Panzerlehr managed to hold up against the onslaughts, and despite desperate efforts by the British to dislodge them, they clung on to their positions. What the Panzerlehr could not do, however, was cover a weakness that opened up on their left flank, between Caen and Villers-Bocage. Here there was a huge gap in the German defences, and at around 1500 hours on the 12th of June, the tanks of the 7th Armoured Division headed for it. Once they'd surged through, it was as if they'd passed through some sort of time warp. For the first time since the Normandy landings, the way in front of the advancing British was clear. Although the terrain, full of small secondary roads and unmade tracks, meant tortuous going for the tanks and half-tracks, there was a heady feeling that at last they'd made a real breakthrough, and that from now on, in the absence of Germans, it was going to be easy. Despite being held up by an isolated German outpost at Livry, where both the British lead tanks were destroyed, the 7th Armoured Division arrived in Villers-Bocage at 0800 hours on the 13th of June. They were greeted by a mass of cheering, weeping civilians who believed that liberation had come at last. The British drove on, straight through Villers, heading for Hill 213 on the high ground to the east of the town. From there, a major road led directly into Caen. What the British didn't know was that they were being watched from a small wood near Hill 213, and the man watching them was the last opponent they wished to encounter. 30-year-old Michael Wittmann was one of Germany's premier tank aces, and a daredevil who'd become something of a legend. In Russia, Wittmann had destroyed 6 T-34 tanks in a single day. By the time he left the Eastern Front, his total of kills stood at 119. Like many men of great daring, Wittmann was a loner. He frequently operated by himself and preferred to do things in his own way. For example, when he found the Tiger's rate of turret traverse too slow, Wittmann devised a method of swinging the whole tank round to face his opponents. At 0800 hours on the 13th of June, Michael Wittmann was in a position on Hill 213, together with 5 tanks, when reports reached him that British armour was arriving in Villers-Bocage. At once, Wittmann set out on foot for a small wood near the town, and from this cover, he watched the British arrive. It was soon evident that they had no idea that Wittmann or his tanks were close by. As Wittmann watched, they stopped for vehicle maintenance and breakfast. Wittmann had seen enough. He raced back to his tank and alerted his crew. There was no time to contact other tank units. Once again, Wittmann was on his own. He headed his Tiger downhill towards the British tanks and half-tracks, spraying them with machine gun fire at almost point-blank range. The first 12 half-tracks were destroyed. When lightly armoured British Honey tanks appeared, Wittmann fired at them with his 88mm gun, then swept past, heading for the centre of Villers-Bocage. His next victims were 3 British Cromwell tanks. Next, running up against more British tanks, he backed up and was headed back for reinforcements when a Cromwell caught him and fired 2 of its 75mm rounds. The shots bounced off the Tiger's frontal armour, and within minutes, the Cromwell had succumbed to Wittmann's 88. The same afternoon, Wittmann was back, with 2 more Tigers, a Panzer IV tank, and more Panzer IVs poised to fire in support from Hill 213. This time, Wittmann destroyed an entire row of Cromwell and Sherman Firefly tanks, together with several Bren carriers. Wittmann sped on, heading for Villers, but there the British had been thoroughly alerted, and he found the town very heavily defended. It was too much, even for Wittmann. 3 of his 4 Tiger tanks were destroyed, and his own was brought to a halt when its track was blown off by a 6-pound British anti-tank gun. 2 more Tigers were destroyed by Piat projectiles. Wittmann and his crew managed to escape, but they left behind them 25 ruined British tanks, 14 carriers, another 14 half-tracks, and several hundred British dead. That evening the Germans were able to seize and hold Villers-Bocage. The damage Wittmann had done and the shock he'd administered at Villers-Bocage had serious consequences. The British drive to Caen, which had begun in such exhilarating mood, had been stopped cold in its tracks, and the Germans had managed to close the last important gap in their battle line. Early on the morning of the 14th of June, the 7th Armoured Division disengaged and withdrew to positions east of Caumont, 3 miles away. With this, a week after D-Day, the early phase in the battle for Caen came to an end. In the immediate aftermath of the early battles for Caen, both sides were utterly exhausted. The tank crews of the 7th Division were so tired, both physically and mentally, that many of them remained asleep throughout the withdrawal to Caumont and didn't even wake up when they reached it. The Germans, in particular the Hitler Youth, were in a similar state, but they at least had the satisfaction of some success. They had not only closed up their line, but defied all efforts to break through it. Grievous casualties had been suffered on both sides. It was reckoned that the 6th Canadian Regiment alone had lost 1/3 of all their casualties in Normandy in a single engagement at Le Mesnil-Patry. As for the Germans, one of their battalions, the 25th, was reduced from 700 officers and men to 539, and in the lull that followed Villers-Bocage, they lost a daily total of 1 or 2 dead and 12 injured and missing per day in the continuing naval and air bombardment. The Allies' failure to capture Caen in the first week of June 1944 was more than just a mote in the eye of the Normandy campaign. The town's strategic position and the role it played as guardian of the route east into Nazi Germany meant that it could not be bypassed or isolated or simply marooned behind the lines of the Allied advance. Even in its ruined state after the Allied air raid of the 6th of June, when almost 3/4 of the town was destroyed, Caen remained the hook on which success or failure in Normandy hung. Plans for the American conquest of the Cotentin and the subsequent breakout from the beachheads depended on its capture. A key component of General Montgomery's plan of attack had been to pin down the German armour at Caen to give the Americans a better chance. But the events of the second week in June had shown what it would cost and how much Allied strength would be diverted if this stance were maintained for long. By inference, then, the capture of Caen was not only the linchpin of Allied success in Normandy, but of the war in Western Europe as a whole. The questions, the doubts and blame that arose out of the fighting around Caen after D-Day centered first and foremost on the overall plan devised by General Montgomery. Montgomery had never been an easy man to like, and he had many enemies, but the workings of personal feuds did not entirely explain why his plan came under so much criticism. Partly this was due to a certain inflexibility in Montgomery's style of leadership. Once a plan was made, he insisted on sticking to it. But doing that around Caen had incurred unacceptably high casualties, and all in the cause of getting nowhere. In the Allied ranks and the officers' mess, severe doubts were expressed about the wisdom of Montgomery's strategy. No one seriously questioned the genius of the victor of El Alamein, but was his plan for Caen the right one, and was it being executed in the right way? There was even talk that Caen had become an obsession with Montgomery, his personal holy grail. If Montgomery had an obsession at all, it was his own unswerving self-discipline. Whatever happened, he always maintained an atmosphere of calm and security, which reassured his troops that everything was going according to plan. Montgomery maintained this imperturbability even when dealing with Eisenhower, Winston Churchill, or his greatest admirer, Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke. Nevertheless, there were signs that deep down, General Montgomery was rattled by the disasters that overtook his troops in the early battles for Caen. Unusually for him, He temporized and insisted that his main purpose at Caen had been to divert German attention from the Americans by using British and Canadian forces to keep them occupied. This, of course, was only part of the truth, something which Montgomery was known to manipulate when it served his purposes. The fact remained that somehow the Germans had managed to resist overwhelming firepower, overwhelming numbers, and Allied supremacy in the air so effectively that they'd fought their opponents to a standstill. The problems that beleaguered Erwin Rommel in the struggle for Caen were of a very different order. The trouble went right to the top, to Adolf Hitler and his fanciful orders for the conduct of the battle in Normandy. Hitler was directing the struggle from his wolf's lair at Rastenburg in East Prussia, with no means of observing its realities. He promised Rommel reinforcements, but Rommel knew perfectly well that they would be under strength and undersupplied. What Rommel really wanted was more personal control over his forces and the authority to order retreats as necessary. Hitler refused, but Rommel would not give up. Together with General Leo Gehr von Schweppenberg, he flew to Rastenburg to confront Hitler in person. They got nowhere with him. Rommel returned to Normandy still determined to change the confrontational tactics Hitler had imposed on him and adopt instead the principle of giving up ground for the sake of a more manageable defense. Rommel and von Schweppenberg managed to receive the backing of their superior, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, but when he telephoned Hitler to put the proposal to him, he was summarily dismissed. The venerable Field Marshal was replaced by 62-year-old General Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, whose view of Germany's war prospects was extremely pessimistic. Von Schweppenberg was also replaced, and though Rommel survived, he was forced to accept Paul Hauser as a new chief of the 7th Army. Hauser, aged 64, had already retired as long ago as 1932, only to have his career reactivated after Hitler came to power the following year. Hauser had the same dismal view as von Kluge. It hardly helped the German cause in Normandy, or Rommel's handling of it, that one of the most important command positions was now held by an old, derusticated soldier who had no faith in his chances of success. The struggle for Caen in the first week after D-Day had proved to be one of the bloodiest, most destructive, yet most inconclusive of the Second World War. But despite the agonizing over-blame on the Allied side and Erwin Rommel's desperate attempt to give his forces better chances for defense, the battle was not going to change its nature. The imperative for the two sides remained the same. The Allies must take Caen. The Germans must prevent them doing so. And deciding which of them would prevail was going to mean war even more total than before.